One of the areas in which humans have traditionally outperformed computers is creativity. And I got brought into this a few years ago because people pointed out to me humans are getting less creative. And why are we getting less creative? Because we're thinking more like computers.
On this episode of Executive Edge, Simon is joined by Angus Fletcher, an expert in neuroscience and literature.
Computers sit around passively, they absorb all the information, they identify high probability patterns, and then they go with the highest probability. That's how a computer works. As a human, you're able to go beyond probability.
Angus is a professor of story science at Ohio State's Project Narrative with a PhD from Yale.
Just as a disclaimer, these LLMs are largely a hoax.
Angus discusses human intelligence versus artificial intelligence, creativity and its decline, and what the human edge is in an AI world.
Your human edge is your ability to be imaginative, which is another way of saying your human edge is your ability to lead, which is, by definition, the thing that no computer can do.
Welcome, everyone, to another episode of Executive Edge, brought to you by one of your co-hosts, Simon Rycraft, here at Tenzing. Excited to continue the track of interviews with experts and academics, experts in their field. The focus today is somewhat neuroscience and broader psychology related, but excited to have with me Professor Angus Fletcher from Ohio State's Project Narrative. Excited to have you on, Angus. Thank you.
It's a huge pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me, Simon.
Right, so I will give a bit of an overview in case anyone doesn't know who you are, and then we'll jump right in. So Angus Fletcher is a professor of story science at Ohio State's Project Narrative with a PhD from Yale. His research into cultivating emotional resilience, creativity, and common sense has been endorsed by National Council of Teachers of English and been called mind-blowing by Malcolm Gladwell, life-changing by Brené Brown, polymathic by Martin Seligman. Angus is author of the best-selling books, or 3 best-selling books, Wonderworks, Story Thinking, and the recently released, get yourself a copy, Primal Intelligence. So thank you again, Angus, for coming on. A lot of the conversations that I've been seeing you've been having online when you've been doing interviews are kind of coming to the surface because of the topic of AI. In the question around, are robots, are AI and LLMs gonna take our job? And I think what's fascinating to me is the challenge that a lot of times is brought to the surface around creativity, right? Humans are different because we are creative, right? We can think on the spot without having to necessarily make decisions based on data or analysis, and that's what differentiates us from the robots or the LLM models where they exist today. Has that always been a basis of your research, or something that is just kind of been brought into the field recently in the last 12 to 24 months?
Well, I have worked in and around artificial intelligence for about 10 years now, which is one of the reasons I'm a pretty hardcore skeptic on AI, and I think we're in an extreme bubble, and particularly LLMs and all these things. I think they're gonna go away. They're gonna be like fanny packs and things like that people thought were like amazing and gonna transform the world, and then all of a sudden they didn't. So the basis of my research is how the brain can be intelligent with little information. That's what I've always been interested in, because, humans are not always smart with little information. A lot of times humans can be pretty dumb with little information, but humans can also be extraordinarily intelligent with little information. Artists, political leaders, entrepreneurs. I work a lot with Army special operators who work in these very kind of contested environments that are very fragile and changing. And if somehow their brains are able to not only survive, but thrive in these uncertain environments. And that's different from how a computer works, because a computer, as we all know, needs lots of data. That's what makes a computer smart. The more data you give a computer, the smarter it gets. And the more data you give a human, the more confused the human gets. So clearly there's something different going on in our brains, and that's why computers are useful, but that's also why they're not going to replace us. Mm-hmm. So a big part of what has sort of happened over the last 10 years is, I got interested in AI because it was different from humans, and because I thought that it was an interesting way to start to illuminate what was unique about human intelligence. But what has instead happened is people have started to go all in on this idea that, there's a general intelligence, there's a right way to be intelligent. And if computers are intelligent, then that proves that, computers can therefore replace humans. And to your point, one of the areas in which humans have traditionally outperformed computers is creativity. Mm. And I got brought into this a few years ago because people pointed out to me humans are getting less creative. we're actually getting less creative. And why are we getting less creative? Because we're thinking more like computers. And so a big part of my recent research has been, how do you turn around that problem? And a big way that you turn around that problem is you start by establishing exactly what it is that makes your brain different from an LLM or a generative AI.
That's fascinating. I remember seeing something, I don't know where the research was conducted, where they had brain scans and images side by side of someone that was being asked a critical thinking based question and someone else that was asked a similar question, but then given the option to answer it using prompts with ChatGPT, and the brain activity on the CT scan was vastly different, and people were ringing bells saying this is a major problem. So your research is more, it's acknowledging the fact that it does reduce creativity, but also highlighting that, we can turn that around.
Yeah. So, okay. I mean, let's start with the fact that, like, when people use ChatGPT, they always perceive themselves as getting more creative. So this is the number one thing. People say, I have so many more creative ideas. But when you put people in a pool, people who use ChatGPT, their ideas are overall less creative as a group than people who don't use ChatGPT as a group. So what's happening there is the chatbot is making you feel like you're more creative, but actually your ideas are converging on the ideas of everybody else that's using the chatbot. Where I actually got interested in this is not so much working with people who are working with AI, because my research sort of predated the current, mania over these LLMs. My research actually started in schools, because what we know is that we've known for over 30 years that the longer a kid stays in school, the less creative she gets. And this is pretty much obvious to anyone from the outside, right? I mean, obviously schools don't teach creativity, but it's kind of shocking and alarming to think that we're putting our kids into schools that are actively making them less creative. It's also shocking to think that that means that we overall, as a society, are less creative than we were when we were born. And so, what's going on there? And there's a couple of things that are going on there. The first thing that's going on is that school is essentially focused on right answers because of the standardized test regime. And so school is essentially teaching you there's a right answer. And the more that you believe that there's a right answer, the less likely your brain is to come up with a new answer. Because when you don't have the right answer, you just default to authority, or you Google something, or you ask AI or whatever, right? And so we as humans are doing less and less original thinking because we think, there's already a right answer out there. I just have to find it. As opposed to the reality, which is I have to come up with a new answer because this is a new situation. And the reason that creativity evolved is because there are, in fact, not answers to 99% of problems. So the first thing is that we are conditioning people to believe that there are right answers when there are, in fact, usually not. The second problem is that ever since the 1940s, and I can talk about why this is, we have gone down this road of thinking that creativity comes from something known as ideation, which is the basis of design thinking and brainstorming. And at the bottom of this is the idea that creativity is based on randomness, particularly random association. Computers are very random. They're capable of much more randomness than humans are. So you would naturally think that computers would be more creative than humans. And you'd also think that we as humans would get more creative if we, just took a lot of drugs and became more arbitrary in our behavior, right? Turns out not to be the case at all. In fact, creativity in the human brain is not driven by randomness. It's highly intentional. It's driven by other processes. And so the second problem is that we as a society have misunderstood creativity as being something that's just arbitrary, when in fact it's incredibly thoughtful. The creatives in your life are incredibly intentional in their creativity.
And so how did you get started? So in the last decade, you've been, some of your research is focused down on evolutions in technology. Your writings of super relevant, just as relevant today, if not more than they ever have been. How did you get your start in? Did you start in neuroscience? Was it broader psychology when you were doing your PhD? Has it kind of evolved to education-based research as well around creativity? Like, how did it all come together?
Yeah, I started in neuroscience, and I started in neuroscience as an alternative to psychology. And I want to mark that because 99% of the thought that goes on in business now that's influenced by understanding of the human brain comes from some branch of psychology. And what you do in psychology is you sit down, you come up with a rational flowchart of the human brain, and then you test that rational flowchart by doing various quantitative studies, like on mTurk or whatever. That is not how neuroscience works. What you do in neuroscience is you look at the actual physical anatomy of the brain. You look at the mechanics of the brain and you say, what is going on? And once you start doing that, you start to realize that neuroscience unlocks a whole bunch of capacities in the human brain that psychology has been blind to. Because psychology essentially comes out of philosophy, essentially comes out of logic, essentially comes out of the same tradition of thinking that gave us computers. What you realize when you come at it from the perspective of neuroscience is the purpose of every neuron in your brain is to initiate action.
Mm-hmm.
It's to come up with a new action. And that's because life is decided by novel behaviors. We live in a biological world where what wins is innovation, your ability to do something that your competitor hasn't done. And so literally every single one of the billions and billions of neurons in your brain is constantly initiating actions. It's not going on or off like a MOS transistor. It's not doing all these kinds of computational things that we're told. It's initiating an action. So one neuron initiates one action, comes up with one new action. You chain together neurons. What you're doing is you're not creating an algorithm. You're creating a chain of new actions.
Uh-huh.
What is a chain of new actions? That's a narrative. That's a story. And so your brain is constantly thinking in story. And you realize this because if I asked you what happened to you today, you wouldn't give me a bunch of numbers. You'd tell me a narrative about what happened with your day. If I asked you about your future, you wouldn't give me a bunch of numbers or a bunch of algorithms or a bunch of symbols. You'd say, here's my plans for the future. A plan is a plot, is a narrative. It's a story, right? So the human brain thinks in story. It doesn't think in math. Yet we have an entire school system that's focused on teaching kids math and other forms of sort of statistical thinking. We have an entire business system that's focused on the idea of rational choices and quant and all these kinds of things, more math. And it's just taking us away from our natural intelligence. And that would be fine if the result of the last 20 or 30 years had been utopia. But I think when we look around the world right now, we see that some things are not functioning that well. And a big part of what's not functioning that well is a failure of imagination. If you talk to political parties nowadays, they're just repeating ideas from the past 10, 20 years. If you talk to most companies, they've given up on actually coming up with new ideas. And they're just like, oh, you know what? AI will come up with the new ideas for us. We'll just stop thinking. We'll just have AI come up with new ideas, And that is not going to work. What's going to work in the future is going back to the natural abilities that the human brain has to tell new stories of the future and make those stories real, which is what drives innovation. The ability that someone like Steve Jobs had, the ability that Nikola Tesla had, the ability that Van Gogh had, the ability that Einstein had, the ability that all these innovators had. And so a big part of my research has been, let's get us away from these computational, quant-based psychology, design thinking, ideation approaches. And let's get us back to how a neuron actually functions based on my own background in the science lab, and then sort of amplified with work that I've since been able to do with creatives in places from, Hollywood to special operations.
Fascinating is the only response I can come up with, to be honest. Is there something then innate in the human brain or human's existence connected back to survival that drives that desire to be somewhat action orientated that LLMs and computer models just don't have? But there's the data driven approach, but what is it instinctive? Is it evolutionary?
Yeah, it's just basic. I mean, life needs to struggle to survive.
Yeah.
So, I mean, the story here, if you want to go back to the origins of the animal neuron, so the neuron, which forms our brain, evolved about 550 million years ago. It evolved during a period known as the Cambrian explosion, or the Big Bang of life. And what basically happened was, prior to this point, you'd had a bunch of life forms, but they were all just sort of bobbing around the ocean, not really doing anything. And if they encountered food, they would eat it, or they would get sunlight. But then all of a sudden, you have this explosion of new life forms. And this creates this huge struggle for life. All of a sudden, there's more life forms than there is food.
Mm-hmm.
So what do you do? So the first thing that intelligence evolves to do is vision. It evolves vision. And vision allows you to see food, and it allows you to go after the food. It allows you to chase the food. Vision is a computational function. It's what AI does. That's why a lot of AI stuff evolves out of research into visual processing and graphical circuits and things like that. That's where NVIDIA comes from, for example.
Mm-hmm.
So there's this huge function of, I've got to eat, I've got to see, I'm going to develop this inductive system in my visual cortex. But at the same time, as you're in this world filled with life forms competing for food, and you've got to see to eat, there's another problem, which is the problem I can't get eaten. because all those things that are swimming around with eyes, a lot of them are trying to eat you. So how do you avoid getting eaten? Well, what you do is you innovate your behavior. You do something that the predator has not seen before. And by doing that, you move in a way that frustrates the logic circuits of their vision, which goes beyond the algorithms in their head. And so they don't catch you. And instead, they eat something else that's less creative. And so this other function starts to evolve. And this function starts to become basic to the motor cortex or the action regions of the human brain. And so this bias towards creativity, as you've said, to initiating new actions. And you see this in the fact that people are naturally restless. The children are just naturally want to do something, right? And they naturally want to do something they haven't done before, right? This is a kind of basic human impulse. And as we get older as adults, we try and focus that, but we still need to maintain it. So, if you ever see a talented surgeon, for example, that surgeon will know how to do a routine operation. But the moment that they open up a patient and all of a sudden they notice that the anatomy is different or the problem is different than they'd seen in the scan, they're able to very rapidly innovate a new surgery. And a lot of times they do that without necessarily thinking intentionally about it. It's almost just like their motor cortex, their fingers are just handling the situation. So I work with a lot of surgeons, so I'm always amazed by this, but you see this happen again and again and again. Same thing with the dancer. A dancer gets on stage. They're able to move their body when they hear a song they haven't heard before in a new way. They're able to innovate. It's not something they're thinking about consciously, but again, their motor cortex is tapping into this ancient thing. And so these are all these low information processes that are non-computational, that are driving innovation, that, as you've said, are driving our survival, because the key to surviving, whether as a surgeon or a dancer, is to be able to handle the new opportunity, the new problem, to distinguish yourself from the field. And that's the thing that we're not training in school. It's the thing we're not nurturing and encouraging in businesses. And so we're now in this very weird situation where a small number of people have managed to protect that ability, that natural ability in themselves. And so they tend to be more successful, whereas everybody else is left in this position of being alienated from their nature and sort of doing everything that they're told, but being less happy, less successful, less fulfilled.
Where does the freedom to fail come in as well, of kind of enabling creativity and, ensuring that you weren't held back from being as creative as you can be? Because I reflect on this a lot with clients, with family members, right? I've also tried to use it to kind of inspire myself, but failure does help you learn, right? It does make you stronger. And I would assume, correct me if I'm wrong, that your the capacity to be creative is going to be driven by, or there's kind of counterproductive to that desire or willingness to fail. Is there a direct link? Do you kind of apply that in the research?
Yeah. So creativity means you're dealing with a new situation in a new way. So there's therefore no way to know if it's going to work or not. You've got to experiment. You've got to try things. You've got to learn through feedback. This is another big difference between us and computers. Computers sit around passively. They absorb all the information. They identify high probability patterns, and then they go with the highest probability. That's how a computer works. As a human, you're able to go beyond probability. So probability is determined based on correlations from the past. A possibility is not something that has been done before, but something that has never been done before. It's something that's allowed by your environment, but no one has ventured previously. And so the human brain's ability to think in possibility means that it's able to venture new things, but those new things might not work. So you do have to be willing to fail. The reality is, however, your tolerance for failure has to be very limited, because if you have a high tolerance for failure, you're eventually going to get eaten, right? And so you've got to be willing to fail in the short term in order to succeed better in the long term. And so what I often say to people is it's that dynamic tension. People who are just willing to fail all the time tend not to get anywhere. People who just want to succeed immediately tend not to get anywhere. But people who have tolerance for failure in the short term as a means to success in the long term, those are the people who tend to succeed and be more effective.
Interesting. So there's a formula of willingness to, or an environment to be creative, right? The understanding of what's a creativity. There's maybe the prior learnings from past failures, whether they be your own, they could be broader, conscious failures that you've heard of that have happened, in other countries or prior generations. But then that healthy willingness to do something new, but then not, throw yourself out of a plane without a parachute to the extreme, right? That is kind of that magic solution.
Yeah. Okay. Well, what it really comes down to, what I've talked about in my research a lot, is this idea known as common sense.
Okay. Yeah.
And so common sense is famously impossible for computers. And you can always test this with an LLM if you ask it a question like, why did my banana eat the color blue? And the LLM will give you an explanation for this, right? It'll be like, well, your banana ate the color blue probably because it needed some more pigment in its diet or something like that, right?
Yeah,
Whereas if I asked you that, you'd be like, that didn't happen, man.
Yeah.
That didn't happen. And what's happening there is the human brain has the ability with very limited information to say, that does not track with reality. That violates in some fundamental way, my understanding of what is possible, right? Because the human brain thinks in possibility, but it also has these bright red lines. And so we have this ability, common sense. And to your point, how do we use this intersecting with failure? Well, or, risk taking. What we do is we say, I always want my behaviors to be as novel as my environment. In other words, if I'm in a pretty familiar situation, if I've been here 100 times before, I should just do what worked in the past. I should just take an answer off the shelf. I should just ask Google, or Gemini AI or whatever else, right? The moment I'm dealing with a new situation, I've got to try something new. I've got to start upping my willingness for failure. If I'm dealing with an incredibly new situation, then I have to do something incredibly new. And I start to have a very high willingness to tolerate failure. So this is where common sense comes in. And the reason I say this is because most people today, because we spend so much time with computers, do the exact opposite of that. So most people today, they take their biggest risks when they feel safe. And the moment that things start to get volatile, they panic and retreat to what worked in the past. When you've actually got to do the opposite. The moment you feel safe, just keep doing it. I know it's boring, but that's how you make the money, man. And the moment that things start to become volatile or uncertain, that's when you really need to try something new. And what we're seeing now is an environment right now characterized by huge amounts of volatility, where everyone is freaking out and becoming conservative and going backwards. And the classic example of this, frankly, is AI. You couldn't have anything more conservative than an AI, because all an AI is doing is regurgitating patterns from the past. It's basically telling you, the answer to this new situation can be found in all these old situations, which is patently wrong. Wow. So common sense is that ability that helps you take the appropriate amount of risk. Kids don't have common sense. As adults, you'd like to think that we do. But as I said, you can see with most adults that they don't take risks in the moments that they would benefit from taking risks in.
So you see this as just the next evolution, similar to the industrialization, right? In kind of the early 1900s, where there was automation that took away the boring tasks that weren't creative, right? And then we just adapted around them, right? We're like, machines can do this better. It allows us to produce more. Let's just keep evolving how that technology works and improving on it. But as humans, we need to then move away and start and move upstream, right? And creativity is the solution to that. This is just another stage gate of technology coming in and taking away the less creative tasks. So we need to acknowledge that, if anything, in theory, that should push us to be more creative.
It's going to have to, if you want to survive, right? Now, right. Just as a disclaimer, these LLMs are largely a hoax. And they are largely a hoax. So, when I talk about AI, I want to be clear that there's tons of responsible smart AI, which is built by software engineers, who are using these various machine learning applications and so on and so forth. And LLMs have some limited applications. They're interesting for certain things when they're in a kind of constrained environment. But the idea that you can talk to an AI and it's going to do your research for you, or the idea that AI can be your therapist. These are ideas, by the way. I've worked with a bunch of psychologists for over 5 years now on using LLMs as therapists, and it's become immediately clear that th're very dangerous in these capacities. So I think that LLMs, these Claude and Grok and GPT we're going to start to see they're very expensive. They're being sort of artificially propped up, and they're going to start to recede, I would say, in terms of the way that they're dominating. But AI in general, computation in general, automation in general, these are things which are here and which are only going to get more insistent. And so, yes, absolutely. Your human edge is your ability to be imaginative, which is another way of saying your human edge is your ability to lead. The future is leadership, because leadership is taking the first step into the unknown, which is by definition the thing that no computer can do.
Yeah, I love that. I can hear murmurs of Carl Jung turning in his grave at the thought that someone is going to use an LLM to analyze dreams, right? I think, that would not make him happy, probably less less concerned as, or more concerned than Freud would be. But let's turn this then to leaders, because you're working with, I mean, experts in so many creative disciplines, and I think business sometimes, we underplay the importance of creativity and just decision making and leadership qualities and communication externally and internally, and dare I say even the dirty phrase change management, right? But it is super important. And I think what I love about the research you're doing with your new book and your broader teachings as well is reminding people of the importance, but also saying it's going to become more important. So you better understand how you can be creative, how you can leverage those skills and encourage your team to be more creative just in everything they do, not ideation based workshops by the beginning of the year, right around budget time, to kind of plan areas for improvement, and then you're just back to the normal boring operations task. This has to be the future of organizations and collective communities and businesses around the world. Otherwise we're screwed.
We're screwed. And, you're missing 98% of the intelligence in your organization if you're thinking this way, and at some point your competitor is going to figure it out and it's going to kill you. And so, really the question is, what do you do when the data isn't there? Because when the data is there, you can follow the data, which is great. You can follow the data, but is following the data something you need a leader for? No, because that's following, What do you need a leader for is you need a leader for those times when the data is absent, or is fragile, or is pointing in different directions. And one of the questions I get all the time is they're like, Professor Fletcher, we of course, we think professors are amazing. You're just wonderful, but we did experience you in school, and we were aware that you were sort of detached from reality, and you had all these like big ideas and stuff, and so on and so forth, but a lot of that stuff doesn't track in the real world. However, it does seem like you were working with an unusual number of highly successful people in the real world. You work with a lot of these, pro sports teams. You work a lot with Army Special Operations. You work with a lot of these big Silicon Valley companies. You work in, all these kinds of places. Are you just like a genius or something? Are you like, what's going on? And the answer is, if you saw me in my daily life, you would realize that I am a classic professor. I am useless at almost everything. My children are always smarter at me than, kind of like basic tasks around the house. But I just happen to understand this little process in the human brain which drives creativity. And so even though you would never want me to tell you what stocks to pick for your portfolio, you would never want me to, plan the next special operation, I'm able to go into all these communities and help them work better, because I'm able to help them identify these processes in their brain and use them better and apply them to their expertise. And I really think that's where the future is. The future is going to be, particularly in schools, helping people identify these processes in their own brains, helping them tap into this creativity, this common sense, this intuition, the ability to see things faster than other people, the ability to understand your own emotions and what they're telling you, all these human processes. And then once you tap into that, you're going to go into your own area of expertise and you're going to apply it better than any professor could, better than any teacher could, because only you know the specifics of your environment. But it's that core understanding of the human brain that we're missing right now, or else we wouldn't be so enamored with computers.
I love it. What is your take on Elon Musk's Neuralink? I know he's not the first person to inject actual hardware right into humans to improve performance, but it does have an interesting intersection with neuroscience specifically. Do you think there's a future where we become truly symbiotic with technology? Our creative brains are then embedded with that, the advancements from data in a kind of quantum computer future of 2080 or 90 or whatever, whenever it will become a reality. Is it something you're worried about, or you think it's just a buzz?
Well, I'm definitely not worried about it. I think it's extremely likely to happen in our lifetime. First of all, let me just say that the human brain is incredibly complicated, and these current attempts are not going to get very far. And as far as something like quantum computing goes, quantum computing is just another way of building a Turing machine. It's not magic. There's this weird idea that somehow if we build quantum computing, it's going to somehow, make computers significantly smarter. There's a whole bunch of errors that lie in this. One of the errors is that somehow if computers become conscious, they'll become smart, all the stuff I've talked about here has nothing to do with consciousness. What makes the human brain smarter than a computer are mechanical operations. They're very boring. They don't require consciousness. A conscious quantum computer would not be able to do these operations. It would just be conscious of being a quantum computer, right? So there's no real big breakthrough in quantum computing. I mean, it might help us with some, cryptography, things like that. There's some minor limited applications. I don't want to make it appear like it's a useless technology, but it seems very unlikely that it's going to be a big deal. As far as something like Neuralink goes, I've already had Elon Musk hating on me for 4 years because I basically said that Tesla was never going to do self-driving cars. So I don't know that I want to, go out and antagonize him again further. But I think what we're seeing there again is his ability to be a kind of sci-fi salesperson as opposed to any plausible technology. And frankly, plugging a computer into your brain would make you dumber. The human brain evolved computation 500 million years ago. So the human brain has evolved computer chips inside it, and it decided that it did not want those chips all over its brain.
Yeah.
It decided that it wanted other forms of intelligence. If the human brain had wanted to become purely computational, it could, and it decided not to. And so the question you have to ask yourself is Elon Musk smarter than 500 million years of biological evolution? It's possible, I suppose, but I'm going to put my money on biology.
I love it. So what's next? Your research has evolved, and in Primal Intelligence is the latest kind of gift to the world, right? In adapting your findings and applying that in multiple disciplines, and it seems like it's any discipline or field can benefit from taking your guidance and your studies. What's next though? Have you got another book that's coming in the future? Is there ongoing research that you're excited about, or you just your goal or your meaning right now or your purpose is just to tell as many people about the importance of primal intelligence and get them becoming more creative?
Yeah, so of course the world definitely needs more books for me, right? It hasn't had enough books for me. I mean, I believe that children are our future, in all honesty. And I think that, one of the reasons I work with special operations is because they gave me a chance to test my research. And I love working with the U.S. Army, and it's given me a ton. But my focus in life is not making better armies. My focus in life is human intelligence. And the reason I've worked with businesses, frankly, is because after I did all this research with the Army, I then tried to get it into schools. And schools were like, we don't know about this Army stuff, And what I discovered is that parents really only trust something when it's worked in business. And so I spent a lot of time working in business because that helped validate the research to people, because they're like, oh, if it works in this company, in these Fortune 50s or whatever, then I trust it in schools. And so my main focus now is working in schools. And in particular, I'm really focused on how to make kids into better leaders. We've got this kind of new training that we're going to roll out here at Ohio State for about 7,000 of our undergraduate business majors. And the basic premise behind it is that leadership is by definition original.
Uh-huh.
So every leader leads in their own way. So you can't teach people how to lead. However, even though every leader leads in their own way, leaders fail in common ways. And what we've done is we've identified 4 of those common failures in the human brain when leaders fail. And we've started to build an experiential curriculum where students can start to go through in real time and walk through those failures and feel what it's like to struggle with that and then get themselves out of it. And what we say is that, a lot of it being a leader is just not failing, to our earlier point, right? If you can manage to hang in there in difficult situations. And so if your audience is interested, the 4 main leadership failures we think are failure of initiative, which means you can't come up with a plan. Failure of emotional confidence, which means you got a plan, but you don't want to risk it. Failure of imagination, which means you've got a plan, but only one plan, and you keep trying to force it. And then failure of strategic vision, which means you can come up with a lot of plans, but they're not going anywhere. And so you're one of those kinds of classic people that's kind of running around in circles, but not making consistent progress. And what we've shown through this training is that we can help students identify each of those problems and then correct it. And the more that we correct it, the more they initiate new plans that have a broader strategic direction, and they start to make independent progress in their own lives. And so hopefully we're going to test that here at Ohio State, and then hopefully we're going to make that available through the Big Ten and any other schools that would like it. And, my hope is by doing so, we start to unlock a lot of the potential that is just sitting in our young people today, because all of us are ready, I think, for a better future.
Yeah, love it. Truly, Angus, thank you so much for coming on. Again, if anyone has not read any of Angus's book, his latest release is Primal Intelligence. Grab yourself a copy. Dinner, coffee. Next time Emma Columbus is on me, Angus, I'd love to keep the conversation going. This is truly fascinating. This has changed my perspective on the importance of reigniting creativity, especially in the corporate world, maybe even doing it, and self-reflecting on where I need to be more creative. So I appreciate your time. So thanks again for coming on.
Thank you.